So first things first, epilepsy warning because we're here in the Rainbow Station. Thus far along the tour, we've sort of been heading east along the main subway line, which ends right here with the East Coast Station in the Rainbow Fortress. And what we're going to do next, for the next few parts, is we're going to loop back around and head towards the center of the map along the deep subway line, which also has a station right here, just like that one. The main subway line and deep subway line both have the same endpoints at the East Coast and the West Coast. The difference is the deep subway line traverses the world at a deeper level. So we're going to head towards the lower green dungeon, and that's the main section that we're going to tour in this part. So that's where we're heading right now. Now, the dungeon as a whole was virtually untouched as far as the blocks and walls. The only difference is sort of what happened with the furniture, with the furnishings and stuff. And before we go in, I'm going to have to summon some summons, because it's going to be really dangerous in there. This is also a good opportunity for me to talk about lore. In case I haven't made it clear thus far, the Green Dungeon is the Precursor capital, right? And the Precursors are this, in lore, the civilization I came up with who basically made everything, every sort of quasi, you know, human-built thing in the world. All the random underground cabins, the random minecart tracks, all the random, you know, houses in the jungle and the dungeon, all of that is Precursor stuff. The stuff that isn't would be the Lizard Temple, the stuff in Hell, you know, etc. Some things like that. But virtually every single thing we see is Precursor. And the other thing that's Precursor is most of the undead enemies. The skeletons, the marching bones, even the skeletal enemies you see outside the dungeon are all Precursor. You know, originally these were all Precursors that eventually became converted into undead, sort of with a zombie plague. The difference is that unlike a normal zombie plague, which was just sort of a mindless horde, these Precursors were controlled by sort of an ancient Precursor being, which I showed off in Part 9. Speaking of Part 9, this is actually the deepest part of the dungeon that Part 9 goes to, right here. This is sort of where the lower dungeon is blocked off, and I added some signs here to show it's like danger below. The idea is, when the new civs discovered the dungeon, they realized that the center of the dungeon is teeming with undead and has an undead army, so they blocked it off, and they looted the outskirts of it, and that's where they got all that furniture and paintings and stuff that are in the upper dungeon floors that I showed in Part 9, and at the very top they have that Precursor Being. But the lower dungeon, as you can see, well, for one, it's teeming with these, like, bone blocks and stuff everywhere. I added a lot of bone blocks, bone platforms, stuff like that. The idea was that originally this place was like a living capital and you know, a place people, you know, that people actually lived. When the Precursor, you know, when the Precursor Being took over and converted everyone to undead forcibly, what happened was it sort of did some renovations, and it added all this, like, bone-based infrastructure. I call this the Bone City. This right here is supposed to be sort of like a shrine. I got, like, bone bathtubs up there because they look spiky and creepy and stuff. Put up a lot of bone torches and bone fireplaces because they have a really eerie, sort of ghostly glow. The idea of the Bone City, that for some reason, it was just building everything out of bones, because that was the material, the preferred material, at least within the dungeon itself. This here is sort of like a bone factory. You got bone welders, you got hanging skeletons. The idea is that they literally built, like, artificial bodies out of bones, you know, for that they could find. You know, that's why there's some Precursor beings that are just like, they have, you know, they look very different. They're giant, like the paladins, for example. So this is just deeper into the Bone City. I didn't change the wall type, you might notice, because you don't want to change the wall type in a dungeon, because then it stops working like a dungeon. Dungeon enemies stop spawning. But I basically added lots and lots of furniture and a lot of this, like, bone stuff. The idea is that there's all these, like, sort of platforms and passageways and sort of catwalks made of bones leading everywhere that are all being supported by these bone beams. Here's another bone shrine. I have put a lot of bone shrines in sort of the small rooms. Most of the shape of the rooms in the blocks was left untouched. This is all how it was, like, originally seated in the world. There's a paladin right there. It's annoying. So this is right here. So obviously not everything in the dungeon is made of bones. A lot of sort of the outskirt areas and things that aren't, you know, things that aren't covered in like bone blocks and bone beams jutting out all over the place. Just sort of like storage areas and stuff. You know, you got vases and urns and books and stuff, and there's residential areas. I tried to make a lot of it feel like a place where people actually used to live. That's what you have here. Now we're in sort of the green slab wall area. I tried to use every type of dungeon furniture for all 3 colors, as well as all the different types of lanterns. So in the slab area, you got the carriage lanterns, or the carriage lanterns, because they sort of have like a dark yellowy glow. I'm gonna head down here now. You might notice the music changing here and there because some of the wall here is not naturally seated. Some of the wall here, like the wall right here, was actually, I replaced it, and that's why this doesn't count as a dungeon biome when I stand in front of that kind of wall. But here, this is naturally placed dungeon wall, so we go back to the dungeon music. This right here is sort of a dark passageway that's supposed to lead deeper into the dungeon along sort of the Z depth direction that we don't normally have access to. The idea is that the capital itself is a lot wider and bigger than just what we see right here, that we just see one part of it. But yeah, there's lots of these little passageways that lead all over the place. You got more sort of green dungeon and gothic furniture over here. You got, yeah, so again, this is sort of part of the outskirty area. Not everything in the dungeon was looted. Again, the new civs, they didn't go very deep into it. They looted just the parts that were sort of further away from the center, from the Bone City area, because the Bone City area was the thing that was teeming with all manner of, like, the skeletal army and stuff. This is just another library, right? That's why this stuff here is basically unlooted. But everything else, you know, the parts, I guess the idea is that they looted the stuff that's only accessible through these, like, dark passageways that we don't really go into. Right, this stuff closer that we can, the stuff that we're touring now, the stuff that's accessible, is the stuff that they didn't loot, because this is the stuff that is close to where the main dungeon army operates. So I'm gonna explain what this is in a minute. Basically, to go over this right now, there are 6 dungeon factions in the world that are based off the 6 dungeon flags. You got the Marching Bones, the Necromancers, the Rusted Company, the Ragged Brotherhood, the Molten Legion, and the Diabolists. These are the 6 main Precursor factions. Everything else, you just got, like, zombies and skeletons and random stuff you see in the world, but those are the 6 main ones. Now, each one of these has its own little mini lore explanation. Basically, the Marching Bones and Necromancer factions, those are the 2 factions that are native to the Precursor capital itself. Right, so that's the other thing. The Precursor factions are from all over the world. They're not all from the Green Dungeon capital, right? But after the plague took over all of the entire civilization, they were all amassed in the Green Dungeon by the Precursor Being. That's sort of in the important lore thing that I haven't mentioned before. So the Ragged Brotherhood, for example, is from the west end of the map in the Corruption, and the Rusted Company is from the giant fortress in the Snowlands that I toured in Part 6. Those 2 factions, once they became invaded and corrupted and converted, they were all brought back and enslaved and taken to the Green Dungeon, where they were all converted into undead. The Marching Bones and Necromancers, they were already in this area. The Molten Legion comes from Hell, right? So the Molten Legion is the one faction that was not created by the skeletal. That's the one faction that wasn't created within the Green Dungeon by the Precursor Being. That faction was created by the demons and then brought over here through this. So the idea of this thing here is that this is actually a hell portal between the Green Dungeon and, you know, the sort of the demon area where the demons built the Molten Legion and gifted it to the undead army. So that's the idea with this, and the reason I put it in sort of the tiled wall section is because the tiled wall is where Hell Armored Bones spawn. Right. Obviously, you understand the different Precursor factions correspond to the different kinds of enemies you see in the dungeon. So Hell Armored Bones correspond to the Molten Legion, so they came from Hell. They did not come from the other areas that Precursors used to live. The only other faction I didn't cover yet would be the Diabolists, but I'll cover them in a later part. So you see here, this is more parts of the Bone City here. This is actually the roller coaster from Part 6. This is where it enters the city. Back in Part 6, I didn't have any of this built, though, so it all looked pretty barren. The platforms do not interfere with the roller coaster at all. It just sort of makes everything look cool. So now we're going back along the depths of the Bone City into the green slab area. So now let me get in here. So here, what the idea here was, this is supposed to be sort of a dark, giant passageway into another, like, massive complex in the city. That's what it's essentially just one giant tunnel. And the idea with the torches is you see them sort of, you know, disappearing in the distance. Is that's like perspective of the depth of the hallway. But the idea is that there's another, like, deeper complex on the other side where, you know, the Bone City continues, and you got more bone structures and more bone factories and stuff for building different kinds of bone bodies for various kinds of undead. The Precursor Being, whatever it wants, you know, in lore, we don't know exactly, the new civs don't know exactly what it wants, but the fact is it is building all kinds of undead, and it probably wants to convert them into undead as well. So here's another bone shrine, again with bone bathtubs and stuff. I added a whole bunch of chests that are just sort of trap chests. They don't really do anything. Lord knows I'm reaching the chest limit for the entire world at this point. So note this area right here. Notice there's a lot of blue dungeon furniture. The idea is that this is sort of like a fancier area, or sort of close to a fancier area, and the blue dungeon furniture looks a lot fancier, which is why I put it all here. Again, these are more tunnels that go deeper into the city that we don't get to see. They go to sort of the blue dungeon area. This would have been where, like, the richer people or the aristocracy or the necromancers themselves live. That's why a lot of the furniture itself is themed skeletally, because that's what they were researching. I guess the idea in lore, as far as the new civs are concerned, is that the Precursors were very interested in trying to raise the dead. They thought that they could discover the secret to immortality that way, or at the very least, make things sort of easier for themselves and have undead servants. It eventually screwed everything up, and they created a Precursor Being that turned all of them into undead. That's what happens. Sad story. Anywho, so yeah, this is another giant tunnel like the green one that I showed before, only it's not the Bone City. This, again, goes into the part of the city that has, you know, all these, like, residential areas for the aristocrats and the necromancers and so on. That's where they would be living. That's why it's all bone-themed. I used blue dungeon because, like, green dungeon furniture looks pretty decrepit and lame. So, let's go back. They have a lot of books everywhere because there was a lot of, like, research and intellectualism going on, I guess, in the Precursor society, the Precursor civilization. So, now we're here. This is supposed to be the center of the city. Note the Precursor symbol right there. Of course, when the undead army took over, they converted it they added bone blocks everywhere, and they added these giant skulls, and they renovated the whole area and added the new aesthetic because they loved it. Again, this is also supposed to be part of, like, the bone factory. You got all kinds of hanging skeletons and crazy like bone structures and welders and furniture, etc. This used to be like the central Precursor town square, or the sort of the center of the city that then became converted and became, you know, the center of the undead city. And yeah, that's sort of the aesthetic there. Now, right here, this passage that I'm going along now, this leads back to the upper dungeon entrance. I'm just gonna show it really quickly. So you see, this part is sort of looted because they looted, the new civs looted this section before sealing it off and realizing they shouldn't go any deeper. So yeah, they got the danger sign. And again, you got these dark passageways leading into, you know, other parts of the city we don't get to see. Another library right there. I put a lot of dungeon crates everywhere. The idea is that a lot of this stuff is still used as storage. The undead army essentially just has two purposes. Obviously, they don't read or use any of the, you know, the artifacts or the paintings, but they do, what they do is they try to create more undead, and the undead just basically walk around and are amassed here. And yeah, that's the idea. So this area, this is actually the area I had the most fun building. The idea is I went for a sort of an Undercity from WoW kind of aesthetic, or Port Phasmastus from RuneScape. So the idea is you got all these like green slime, you got green colored liquid all over the place. It's all very gooey and it looks really gross, and you got these skulls that are like, you got green slime pouring out of them. The idea of this, of course you cannot swim in it unfortunately. This is Sandfall block painted green, and I put white Gemspark wall behind it to make it look brighter. But that's actually the thing, is that if I would deactivate this and be down there, then dungeon enemies would stop spawning, because they only spawn when there's naturally placed dungeon wall behind you. So you have to be sort of careful when building in the dungeon. You can't mess around with the wall type too much. So most of what I did is just I added deactivated blocks. This right here is supposed to be a sort of a ectoplasm factory refinery thing. As you see, it takes the slime. So this is not sewage or anything. It's supposed to be its own chemical substance called, I'm just calling it slime, but it takes the slime, it does some stuff to it, it converts it into this like sort of light bluish ectoplasm, and it uses the ectoplasm to give ancient precursor spirits their bodies. And that's what you're seeing right here, is that you have the you got the dungeon spirit flags that are used to resemble like dungeon spirits themselves, you know, are given corporeal form basically. So the idea with what's being done here by the undead army is that they're taking ancient precursor spirits that are still alive and converting them and keeping them alive indefinitely in this sort of, you know, ectoplasm form, and then attaching that ectoplasm spirit and giving it a skeletal body. So that's why these dungeon spirits will fly out of various dungeon enemies. So essentially all the precursors, after they were converted to undead, they didn't die, they didn't let them die, they keep reusing skeletal bodies with old precursor spirits. So it's kind of like a sick enterprise that's going on. This here, it's supposed to be a weird, it's not a sigil, it's supposed to be part of the machinery. I don't know quite what it is, I just like, I put it down because it looked really cool and interesting. Yeah, I don't have quite a sense as to what this is. I guess it's part of the machinery. That's basically it. I could have made that whole sort of green undead sewer area a lot bigger, but as it stands, I didn't. Again, this is just more of the outskirts and residential area. That's essentially it. Again, I put all the lanterns. You got oil rag sconces, you got brass lanterns over there, you got metal platforms, and you got dungeon shelves and wood shelves, etc. So now we're heading to just the very last chunk of this place, right there. So I'm just going to teleport here. This is like, so like I said, I put a giant tunnel into other complex parts of the city out of each dungeon brick. I showed the green and blue one already. This is the pink one. You got pink brick, and the idea is that that's sort of the area where like the wizards and this leads to the complex area where the wizards and researchers and scientists and the intelligentsia of the precursor world would have lived. That's why you have these bewitching tables and stuff like that. So yeah, that's basically it. And yeah, you got the Diabolus lamps here because, oh, so let me show you. There's another hell tunnel right at the bottom. Not a hell tunnel, a hell portal. So basically a way for me to introduce every type of lantern and platform and dungeon furniture type into this one build. Of course, I couldn't mess with the wall at all. That's the only real thing. So yeah, there you have it. That's the other hell portal. So there's two hell portals that they use to procure the Molten Legion. Why the demons made this deal with the Precursor Being and why they're supplying his army, that much the new Cids don't know, and frankly I haven't totally thought of the reason in lore. I guess the demons, they want to destroy humanity, but what the Precursor Being wants, I haven't quite figured out. Not that important though. Anyway, that's it. That's the lower dungeon. That's the Precursor capital. Most of this build was essentially for lore, but that's basically it. And next is part 13, where we're going to go deeper along the deep subway line. Cheers.